Even the best movies have small errors that practically no one noticed until someone tells you. Like the little mistake that happens in the movie Minions: The Rise of Gru, when the little aspiring supervillain goes to meet the Vicious Six and ends up meeting Dr. Nefario in his record salesman version. And he watches attentively as Gru puts the record on and accesses the secret location for the interview. But when the scene cuts back to Gru after he spins the record backward, Nefario simply vanished. Either a customer arrived to buy records, or they simply forgot that Nefario should be there, observing Gru's first steps as a supervillain, at least until the elevator goes down.
That is pretty.
That was just the first of the 16 mistakes we've gathered today to show you in the Minions and Despicable Me movies. Honestly, I love Gru's movies and his family, but I have to tell you that right at the beginning of the first movie, there's a tiny, almost imperceptible error. Remember that boy who falls into the pyramid and then ends up flying and everyone finds out it was stolen? If you look closely, you'll notice that when he falls, he's holding a small toy airplane in his left hand. But when he's thrown into the air, magically the airplane is now in his right hand. I find it hard to believe that the boy switched hands while being thrown. Do you? And it seems that this confusion regarding characters switching hands wasn't exclusive to the little boy in Egypt. When Gru goes to the Bank of Evil to try another loan, something very similar happens with Mr. Perkins, the manager there. While he's making a comparison involving the apple, it's in his left hand. But when he turns to threaten Gru, it magically appears in his right hand. Either we were watching the scene in a mirror, or someone made the same mistake twice in the same movie. Furthermore, another thing that can be noticed in this scene is a spatial and distance error. You see, when Mr. Perkins is giving his brief speech as a financial villain, it's quite clear that he's a few steps away from Gru. I'd say easily about 2 meters or more. However, when he turns to crush the apple, suddenly Gru is right next to him. I really have to congratulate Mr. Perkins, because for a man his size, he's really fast. Or maybe it was just a logic error that practically no one ever noticed.
If we don't start getting our money back. Get the picture?
Moving from the first to the fifth film of the franchise, Minions: The Rise of Gru, we see a mistake that practically no one noticed. When young Gru is with his minions, he talks to Otto, and we can see that one of the helpers is covered in green paint. Again, there's one lone minion covered in green paint, and he was behind Gru. But shortly after, behind Otto, we can see the same minion smeared in green paint. And when the plan opens, we can finally dispel the doubt and see that the green minion is no longer behind Gru, but next to him. Now, admit it to me, you never noticed that, did you? If the answer is yes, I think we deserve your subscription for this revelation. Going now to Despicable Me 3, we see a big continuity mistake in the scene where Gru and Drew are taking a ride in Drew's hypersonic vehicle. Notice that at the beginning, we see Gru wearing a seatbelt, as the supervillain traffic regulations require, but then he's hanging onto the vehicle. How did that happen if he was wearing a seatbelt? Maybe Drew needs to file a complaint with the villain vehicle manufacturer stating that seatbelts appear and disappear out of nowhere. In the Minions movie, we see the 3 main minions hitchhiking on the side of the highway, and we can notice a small mistake. If you look closely, you'll see that both the license plate of the van giving a ride to the hippie and the license plate of the car driven by the old lady singing are exactly the same, D6413. Which means that most likely someone at Illumination was too lazy to change the numbers on the plate and decided to use the same one for both vehicles, thinking no one would notice. But we did. Certainly one of the most unforgettable scenes in Despicable Me 2 is when Lucy appears and meets Gru. She gives him a tremendous shock, causing him to faint, and when that happens, he accidentally drops his freeze gun on the ground and it ends up beside the unconscious Gru. But then, when we see her dragging Gru by the feet, we can see that the freeze gun simply vanished. I don't think she put the gun in her purse. Actually, I'm almost sure she didn't.
Oh, it works so good.
And this wasn't the first time things with Gru appeared and disappeared like a magic trick. In the first movie, when Gru gets home and goes to talk to his neighbor, after freezing all the people inside the cafe, we see him leaving the place with a small bag. And when he gets to his house and talks to his neighbor, he's totally empty-handed, which is normal if he ate everything on the way. And when he's inside his house with the same bag of bread and donuts in his hands, my question is, could Gru be a fan of Mr. M, the magician of magicians? Back to Despicable Me 3, let's talk about a logic error in the movie that kind of left several people puzzled. The villain of the movie, Brat has as one of his weapons the bubblegum ball that can't be pierced by bullets or by minions gone crazy with picks and axes. Even with this super resistance, it couldn't bear Gru's weight. Is that right, production? And it really seems that Brat's bubblegum has some weakness against the Gru family, since Lucy also manages to pierce it relatively easily. Okay, Lucy is quite strong, but being stronger than something that can withstand bullets from guns? I think that would be a bit of an exaggeration, don't you think? When the minions finally get a ride with the family heading to the villain convention, we notice another continuity error. Bob has a kind of utility box where his teddy bear is kept. We see Bob taking it out from there before getting into the car. The detail is that he leaves this box on the side of the road, so why doesn't it appear in the next scene, when we can see the car speeding away? Okay, they are thieves, but nobody saw them taking the utility box, right? It really seems like it was a mistake. And if you're a fan of the Minions and Gru, prove it by commenting down below. #villain, since that's the real calling of both the Minions and their boss since childhood. Now, this is an error for those who are geography buffs, or just really curious, like us. At the beginning of Despicable Me 2, we see the Antarctic Research Station being robbed by a supervillain, who we would later find out was El Macho. But the fact is that on the huge screen of the Anti-Villain League, there are latitude and longitude data from, but if you put this data into Google Maps, they end up in a region of Sudan, one of the African countries that are very close to the Sahara Desert, which have savanna forests. In other words, a region much less cold than the Antarctic that the coordinates indicated. I'm sure Illumination didn't count on our curiosity. When Gru arrives at the waiting room for his interview with the Vicious Six, we see that there are other candidates waiting in the same place. One of them is Butcher, who has an apron of a butcher, and this apron is hanging around his neck, as we can see in this scene. But when he's called, we can see that the design of the butcher's apron changes, and it becomes more like a jumpsuit. Of course, we're not fashion experts for villains, but that was definitely a rather drastic design change in a few seconds. In the same scene, we also notice another small detail. On the table, in the part where we see Gru trying to make conversation, we see that the table is completely clean, with no magazines on top. But when he leaves to do the interview, we can see that there are some magazines on it. Unless the table is magical or produces magazines automatically, this was definitely a small mistake. When Gru is at the Anti-Villain League headquarters, he takes along two minion henchmen, and we see that one of them is holding a starfish that was on Gru's head when he's thrown out of Lucy's car trunk. As Lucy starts explaining the theft that occurred in Antarctica, we see that he's still holding the starfish in his hand. But soon after, when the boss starts talking, the starfish disappears and is no longer seen. Returning to the first film of the franchise, it's impossible to forget the scene where Gru tries to break into Vector's mansion and fails miserably. At times, we can see that Gru is wearing night vision goggles and laser beams. But when he's about to be annihilated by Vector's weapons, we can see that he's wearing these same goggles, but this time they're not on his eyes, but on his head. And then there's that huge explosion, and we see Gru completely blasted out of a hole caused by the weapons. But the detail is that we can see he's completely covered in dirt from the explosion, except his eyes, as he's wearing protective goggles. But as we just saw, at that moment he wasn't wearing the goggles. So theoretically, this makes no sense. Don't you agree? Despite these small errors, Minions and Despicable Me are definitely some of my favorite animations, without a doubt. While we wait for the next films in the franchise, we've selected these amazing videos popping up on your screen for you to watch and enjoy. Just pick whichever one you prefer and click. Thanks, and see you in the next video.